Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The sun hung low over the Arizona territory, spilling its dying gold across a land that had seen more heartbreak than harvest. Dust curled in soft spirals above the earth, carrying with it every whispered sorrow, every quiet memory, and every secret the land refused to bury. It was a land that shaped its people with fire and left no room for weakness. A land where every breath marked another day of survival. And in this harsh, unforgiving world lived a woman who felt cast aside by both fate and her own people. She moved alone along the riverbank, her figure wrapped in worn buckskin stitched long ago by steady, hopeful hands. But hope had thinned in her life, just as the river had thinned through the droughts. Her name was Kosa, a woman of the Apache, once considered promising, strong, and destined to lead. Yet now she walked with a shadow heavier than any burden she had carried before. The tribe had changed. War had taken too many lives. Hunger had taken even more. And fear had carved the final wound. After the raids, after the shifts in alliances, after the losses that no one was permitted to speak of, Kosa found herself pushed aside. Not with cruelty, but with a weary, resigned distance, as if she were now a reminder of the tribe's darkest days. The eligible men had turned their eyes toward younger women, women untouched by tragedy, women believed to hold better fortune. And the elders had grown silent around her, their glances sharp and brief. A woman without a husband carried no future in Apache ways. No protection, no children, no legacy. It was as though the wind had begun to pass through her, as if she were already a spirit. But Kosa was not spirit. She was still here, her heart still beating stubbornly against the weight of rejection. She felt the ache of it every night when the fires burned low, and every morning when she woke to see herself unchosen again. She was no longer young. She was no longer seen, and she knew that staying meant slowly fading into someone the tribe spoke of only in past tense. So she walked toward the borderlands, toward the place where the territories blurred and the world grew dangerous, toward the settlement where cowboys drifted like ghosts and where the law was as unpredictable as the desert sky. She walked not because she wished to abandon who she was, but because the tribe had already abandoned her in all but name. And the woman she once was, bold, fierce, admired, could not bear to wither quietly. The river beside her shimmered in the fading light. She paused, studying her reflection. Her face was strong, weathered by the desert wind. Her hair, once braided with pride, now hung loose, tangled by many restless nights. She looked like a woman who had fought too many battles and carried too many memories. She looked like a woman who still had something left to give, even if no one wished to receive it. The world around her was changing. Cowboys now rode paths once sacred. Settlers plowed land once free. Soldiers raised flags where only the wind had moved. And deep inside, Kosa wondered if the life she sought might lie not among her own, but among the strangers she had been raised to avoid. She walked until the smell of smoke threaded the air. Campfire smoke, faint and drifting. Far ahead, beside a rocky ridge, a single horse grazed loosely on sparse grass. Nearby stood a man tending a small fire, his hat low, his shoulders broad beneath a worn coat. A cowboy, alone, as solitary as she felt. His presence stirred something in her, a sense of possibility or maybe desperation. She could not tell the difference anymore. Kosa moved slowly, carefully, her steps soft on the earth. She was not afraid. Danger no longer threatened her. Being unwanted was its own kind of fearlessness. The cowboy stiffened slightly at the sound of her approach, but she remained still until he understood she meant no harm. She sensed caution in his posture, but also curiosity. She studied him from a distance, the orange firelight brushing over his face, revealing a man shaped by hardship just as she was, a man who carried loneliness like an old companion. A man who had wandered far enough into Apache land to prove he had lost something or was searching for something of his own. The desert wind shifted, carrying with it the weight of her unspoken need. Kosa knew what she must do, though shame prickled at her skin. It was not in her nature to kneel, to beg, to place her destiny in the hands of a stranger. But the world had changed, and she could no longer rely on pride alone. She needed a place, she needed a future. She needed, perhaps more than anything, a man who would not turn his back when she reached out. So she stepped into the light of his fire. She stood tall, but her heart trembled beneath her ribs. She was done waiting for fate to offer her a second chance. She would carve it out herself, even if she had to ask for it. In that moment, far from her people and far from any certainty, she made a choice that would alter the course of both their lives, a choice born from desperation, but also from courage. She would ask this cowboy for something no one else had offered her. One last chance at a life where she was wanted, a life where she was not alone, a life with a husband. And as the fire crackled between them, the desert holding its breath, Kosa felt the world shift beneath her feet, carrying her toward a destiny she had never imagined. The cowboy studied the Apache woman from across the fire, the flames casting shifting patterns across her determined face. Though he had known danger, loneliness, and the rugged silence of the frontier, he had never encountered anything quite like the quiet desperation that clung to her like smoke. There was a fierce dignity in the way she stood, yet an ache beneath it, as though she had carried her pride until it had worn thin. She was not a wanderer passing through. She was a woman seeking something deeper, something final. Cade Hollister had lived many years with the ghost of a life he once believed he would have. The frontier had taken most things from him, livestock, money, and even the woman he had hoped to marry. The last one haunted him most. Loss had shaped him into a man who spoke little and trusted even less. His days were spent drifting from camp to camp, fence to fence, herd to herd, trying to outrun the memories that clung to him like burrs in a horse's tail. Yet now, standing before him was a woman shaped by rejection, as surely as he had been shaped by grief. A woman who seemed to have been stripped of everything except her will to keep moving. Her arrival in his camp felt like something more than coincidence. It felt like the desert had placed her there on purpose, weaving her fate across his in a way neither of them had expected. As the fire crackled low, Cade's mind moved back to the settlement he had left only 3 days earlier, the place where he had realized he no longer belonged. The ranch owner's new wife had looked at him with suspicion, whispering that cowboys without roots could not be trusted. The younger hands had challenged him, eager for a fight he refused to give, and the foreman had quietly suggested it might be time for him to move on. The world had shifted beneath his boots, pushing him out as gently and ruthlessly as time itself. The prairie had become the only place he still understood. Now, as he watched Kosa, the Apache woman who carried her hurt in the rigid line of her spine, he felt something stirring in him, an emotion he had kept locked away. He recognized in her the same emptiness he carried, the same hunger for belonging, the same fear of fading into a life no one remembered. She stood beside the fire as though prepared to be turned away, prepared even to walk alone into the wilderness if he offered nothing. The desert wind pulled at her long dark hair, lifting the strands like threads of night. Her face, strong and proud, revealed nothing of the battles she had fought, but everything of the longing that had driven her here. Cade had met many Apache people in his wanderings, traders, riders, warriors, but never had he encountered one who approached a cowboy camp without warning or weapon in hand. Her presence alone spoke volumes about how deeply she had been pushed to the brink. No Apache woman, strong of spirit and raised in the traditions of her people, would ever seek help lightly, let alone from a drifting cowboy with nothing of value to offer. Her desperation was not careless. It was carved from survival. As the night deepened, Cade found himself noticing details that spoke of her resilience. The careful stitching on her buckskin dress despite the rough wear, the leather pouch at her side repaired again and again, the faint fading of paint patterns on her wrists, symbols of who she once was. She had not abandoned her identity. She had merely been left behind by those who had once shaped it. Kosa remained at the edge of the fire's glow, still as stone yet trembling beneath the surface. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who had considered every consequence, every danger, and every shame before taking this final risk. Her choice to approach a stranger's camp was not born from recklessness. It was born from a heart that refused to be silenced. Cade felt the desert shift around them, as though the earth itself recognized the crossing of their paths. He sensed that whatever had brought her here had also been pulling him forward, drawing him out of his own solitude. He had always believed he would spend his life alone, drifting until he had no more miles left to ride. But fate had a way of weaving two broken lives together when neither expected it. Kosa, meanwhile, felt the weight of the moment settle across her shoulders like a blanket of sand. She had spent months watching the tribe change, watching men pass her by as though she were a lingering storm cloud instead of a woman capable of strength and loyalty. Each rejection had eroded the last remnants of confidence she possessed. But in Cade's eyes, measured, weathered, and careful, she sensed something different. He looked at her not with judgment, but with recognition, as if he understood the silent breaking that lived inside her. The night air cooled, and a distant coyote cry echoed across the plains. The world around them drifted into a soft, unsettling quiet. And in that stillness, Kosa felt a strange calm settle over her. She had reached the point where fear no longer mattered, only possibility did. Cade stepped aside from the fire, giving the Apache woman room, silently acknowledging that her presence was not an intrusion, but a crossing of paths fated by the land itself. He was a man accustomed to life's unpredictable turns, and he sensed that this was another turn, one that would not be easily undone. For a long stretch of time they stood facing the fire, neither speaking, neither moving, two souls shaped by loss, two wanderers abandoned by the places they once called home, two strangers bound together by the quiet truth that they had nowhere left to go. The desert night deepened, and the flames cast long shadows behind them, merging their silhouettes into one. A woman seeking a husband because no one wanted her, a man who believed no woman ever would again. The fire smoldered softly, preparing to fade, and the world held its breath around them. A new chapter of their lives was quietly beginning. Dawn crept over the horizon with a quiet softness, brushing pale gold across the desert floor. The fire in Cade's camp had burned down to ash, leaving a thin coil of smoke rising into the awakening sky. The world was silent except for the shifting breeze and the distant call of a hawk circling above. Cade Hollister rose slowly, accustomed to the stiffness that came from sleeping on hard ground, and turned his gaze toward the Apache woman still sitting at the edge of the camp. Kosa had not slept. She had remained in the same place throughout the night, her posture straight despite her exhaustion. Her eyes had watched the horizon as if waiting for a sign or daring the sun to test her resolve. The desert light softened her features, revealing a determination woven tightly with fear. She looked like a woman standing on the last ledge of the life she once knew, staring into the unknown and refusing to let it swallow her. Cade recognized the weight of what she carried. He had felt it himself many times, the moment a person chose to step away from everything familiar. A moment born not from bravery but from necessity. Survival had pushed them both into this unexpected crossing of paths. Yet there was something else in the air that Cade couldn't name, a silent pull drawing them into a story neither had asked for. Kosa rose gracefully, despite her fatigue. She moved with the practiced strength of a woman trained by long traditions she no longer truly belonged to. The tribe she had once served with loyalty no longer saw her as essential. She had watched younger women step into roles and futures she had prepared for, while she had been left in the shadow of her tribe's shifting priorities. Her presence became a reminder of old grief, of battles lost, of limbs carried back from raids wrapped in hides. She had survived, but too many believed her survival came with a curse. She had walked away rather than with her. As the sun grew brighter, Cade studied her composed movement, noticing how she scanned the horizon for danger, how her hand always hovered near the small blade strapped to her thigh, how her breath steadied itself before she stepped deeper into the camp. She was a warrior by upbringing, but a woman wounded by loneliness. Her spirit was not broken, only starved. Cade felt a tug somewhere deep in his chest, an old ache resurfacing. He had spent years believing his life was meant to be lived alone, drifting from one ranch job to the next, from one campfire to another. But the sight of this woman, abandoned not by weakness but by fate, struck him in a place he had buried long ago. Kosa moved to examine the saddle resting on Cade's horse. She touched the worn leather with familiarity, understanding instantly that Cade was a man who had lived more years on horseback than on solid ground. She did not speak, but her movements revealed a silent judgment of his life, his choices, his wandering spirit. Cade watched her with caution, aware that trust between them still balanced on a thin line. Yet something had shifted overnight. Kosa no longer carried the raw desperation she had when she approached the camp. Instead, she seemed to hold on to a fragile sense of direction. She had come seeking a husband, not from desire but from survival. Among her people, a woman without a husband became a ghost lingering at the edge of the tribe, unclaimed and unprotected. In this new world of moving borders and encroaching settlers, being unwanted was a sentence of isolation. She craved stability as much as she craved belonging. She needed a partner, someone who would stand beside her rather than shrink from the shadows of her past. Cade knew these truths without hearing a single word. He sensed them in her every breath, every movement, every glance at the distant mountains she had left behind. The more he understood her reasons, the more he felt the desert tightening its grip around the path they were stepping into together. Kosa gathered herbs from the sparse bushes around the camp and knelt to grind them into a paste. Her hands moved automatically, as though performing a ritual from a life she was trying to protect. Cade realized she was preparing something medicinal, perhaps a healing salve. She applied it to a shallow wound on her arm, a mark from thorny brush or rough travel. It was a simple act, yet it revealed so much about her independence and resilience. Still, beneath the resilient surface, a different truth lingered. She no longer wanted to survive alone. Cade's horse shifted restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. Kosa paused and looked at the animal, her expression softening for the first time. Horses were sacred to her people, symbols of strength and spirit. The animal seemed to accept her presence more easily than Cade did. It lowered its head slightly, and Kosa placed her hand gently against its jaw, grounding them both. As midday approached, Cade began packing his gear, the few items he carried from one lonely camp to the next. Kosa watched him, recognizing the familiar rhythm of a man who had spent years untethered. He was preparing to leave, not to abandon her, but because men like him never stayed in one place for long. Yet she also knew that following him meant walking into a future she could not predict. The world beyond her homeland was foreign, filled with ranch towns and saloons, with drifting workers and men who believed Apache women were not to be trusted. But she sensed that Cade was different. He did not treat her presence as a threat or a burden. He observed her with a quiet acceptance, not pity, and that alone made him the first man she had approached without feeling invisible. Cade secured his saddle, lifted his pack, and stood facing the horizon. Kosa stepped beside him, not behind him, not ahead, but beside. She had made her choice long before sunrise. She had chosen the long road over the empty campfires of the past. She had chosen this cowboy, not because he was the most promising man she had ever seen, but because he was the only one who did not look at her with fear or dismissal. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary. The land itself carried their unspoken agreement. Two broken lives bound by the quiet necessity of survival, both stepping into a future neither fully understood. As Kosa took her first step beside Cade, leaving the remnants of the camp behind, the desert wind shifted once more. It carried with it the faint scent of change, and the promise of a bond forged not by fate alone, but by the desperate courage to reach for something new. The sun climbed higher, guiding them toward a road that would test them both. The land ahead stretched wide and pale beneath the afternoon sun, a vast openness that revealed every weakness and every strength in those who dared to cross it. Cade and Kosa moved steadily across the desert, their footsteps leaving faint imprints in the dust behind them. For miles, neither looked back. The past had already taken everything it wanted from them. Now they followed a road of necessity, two strangers learning the weight of walking side by side. Cade kept a measured pace, guiding his horse through the rough terrain, while Kosa walked easily at the animal's flank. She carried herself with a quiet endurance, born from years of traveling harsh trails with her tribe. Her breath remained steady despite the growing heat, and her gaze scanned the horizon with the instinct of someone trained to read danger in the smallest ripple of grass or cloud of dust. Cade observed this silently. There was an unspoken confidence he felt having her beside him, though he did not allow the feeling to settle too deeply. Life in the frontier had taught him that trust was a fragile thing, easily given in moments of need, easily shattered by the turns of fate. Kosa, too, felt the tension of their fragile partnership. Her decision to follow Cade had been born from desperation, but as the hours passed, the choice began to feel like something deeper. She watched the cowboy's careful movements, the way he adjusted the reins with a steady, experienced hand, the cautious sweep of his eyes as he tracked the land ahead. He lived with the awareness of someone who had suffered loss, and she sensed that his heart, like hers, carried more wounds than he showed. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of sage. Cade halted, listening. Kosa instantly stilled beside him, her posture alert. The world shifted with a sudden tension, a warning whispered through the air. Trails like the one they walked were seldom empty. Travelers passed through, some honest, many not. And though the land was wide, danger often moved in silence. Ahead, a thin trail of dust rose between the rocks. Cade gripped his horse's reins tighter, his instincts sharpening. Kosa glanced in the same direction, her eyes narrowing. She recognized the pattern in the dust, the uneven spread, the hurried rise. Someone was riding hard, pushing their horse through rough ground. It was not the calm travel of a harmless rancher or trader, it was the approach of someone with intent. The moment stretched thin. Kosa stepped closer to Cade, though not out of fear. She moved with the purpose of someone preparing for whatever might come. Cade felt the shift beside him and glanced down at the warrior woman he barely knew, yet somehow trusted more than many he had known for years. Her expression was calm, almost resigned, as if she had lived enough hardship to understand that danger was simply another turn in the long road of life. The rider appeared over the ridge, a man in tattered clothing, rifle slung across his saddle, posture aggressive and unsteady. Cade recognized the type even before the stranger came close. Drifters like this one roamed between settlements, living off what they could take, feeding on the vulnerabilities of travelers who wandered alone. Kosa saw the danger, too. She adjusted her stance subtly, placing herself where she could move quickly if needed. The rider slowed as he approached, circling the pair in a deliberate arc. His gaze lingered on Kosa with a hunger Cade immediately recognized, a predatory interest sparked by the sight of a lone Apache woman far from her people. Cade felt a surge of something sharp inside him, an instinctive protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. Kosa, however, stood motionless, enduring the scrutiny with a stillness carved from countless moments of being judged, dismissed, and underestimated. The encounter carved a heavy silence through the desert. Cade kept his hand near his belt, and Kosa lowered her gaze slightly, not out of submission, but to avoid provoking a man who clearly searched for a reason to act. The tension twisted like a tightening rope. The rider's eyes flicked between Cade and Kosa, measuring them, weighing risk against desire. Cade's presence clearly complicated whatever thought he entertained, and after a long, unsettling moment, the man jerked the reins, spurred his horse, and rode off in a cloud of dust, angry, frustrated, and dangerous enough to remain a threat. The land quieted again. Kosa's breath eased, though her shoulders remained tight. Her eyes followed the disappearing rider until he vanished behind the hills. Cade scanned the horizon again, ensuring they were alone. Kosa turned her face toward the ground for a moment, her expression unreadable. Encounters like that were reminders of the world she had walked into, one where she possessed neither the protection of her tribe nor the status settlers granted their own women. Her path had always been dangerous, but it became even more precarious in the territories where cultures collided and mistrust brewed like storm clouds. Cade saw the shift in her posture, the quiet acknowledgement of vulnerability she seldom allowed others to witness. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on him, though no words had been exchanged. He understood then that traveling with Kosa was no simple act of companionship. It was a test of trust, a test of survival, and a promise he had not yet spoken, but was already beginning to carry. The sun dipped slowly toward afternoon. The two resumed their journey, but something had changed. They no longer walked merely beside each other. They walked with an awareness of shared danger, shared burden, and shared fate. Kosa felt the shift too. She sensed that Cade was no longer simply tolerating her presence, he was silently protecting it. And though she had spent years feeling unwanted, years believing she had nothing left to offer, she began to feel a faint spark of worth flicker within her. Cade did not see her as a curse or a burden. He treated her like someone whose safety mattered. As they followed a narrow trail toward the distant foothills, the sky deepened into a muted orange. The air cooled, and their shadows stretched long across the desert floor. Cade stopped when they reached a cluster of rocks offering shelter from the coming night. He dismounted and began setting up a small camp. Kosa gathered dry wood for a fire, falling into the rhythm of shared labor with an ease that surprised them both. A fragile partnership had taken root, born not from affection, but from necessity. Yet, beneath the necessity, something deeper stirred. Shared loneliness, shared resilience, shared danger, shared destiny. As darkness spread across the desert and the first stars flickered awake, Cade and Kosa settled beside the growing fire. The warmth illuminated their faces, revealing a quiet closeness born from the day's trials. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Something had shifted permanently, something that would shape everything that came next. Night settled heavy over the desert, coating the land in deep shades of blue and shadow. The fire Cade and Kosa built crackled softly between them, offering the only warmth in a world that had grown colder the farther they traveled from their pasts. Beyond the glow of the flames, coyotes cried out across the plains, calling to each other through the darkness. The sound reverberated across the empty land, echoing the loneliness that had clung to both wanderers for so long. But now, for the first time in years, neither sat alone. Cade leaned back against a rock, his hat pulled low as he listened to the whisper of the approaching wind. His mind drifted through memories he seldom allowed himself to revisit. The abandoned ranch, the woman he once planned to marry, the life that had crumbled in his hands like old parchment. That failure had shaped him more than any wound, driving him into a life where he expected nothing and hoped for even less. Yet Kosa's presence disrupted the steady emptiness he had carried for years. Her silent strength, her resilience after rejection, and the weight of her unspoken plea had begun to settle into him like a seed waiting for rain. Across the fire, Kosa sat with her knees drawn close, staring into the flames with a distant expression. She looked peaceful in the firelight, but inside, her thoughts churned with uncertainty. She had left behind a world that no longer wanted her, stepping into one that knew nothing of her worth. She had long believed she was fading into invisibility, a woman caught between youth and age, between tradition and survival, between past identity and future hope. But now she walked beside a man who neither feared her nor judged her. Cade did not treat her as a burden or a shadow. He treated her like a person deserving of a place by the fire. It was more than she had been given in years. As the fire burned low, fatigue pulled them into sleep. And with the rising sun came a day that would test both their endurance and the fragile trust forming between them. The morning brought cooler air, drifting softly across the plains. Cade saddled his horse while Kosa folded the blankets they had used. Their movements flowed with the quiet coordination of two people who had already begun to understand each other's rhythms. Without words, they resumed their journey, moving toward the faint outline of distant hills where Cade knew water and shelter might be found. Hours passed. The terrain shifted from open plains to scattered brush and rocky ridges. Cade's horse moved carefully over uneven ground. Kosa walked lightly, reading the landscape with the instincts of someone raised by the land itself. She noticed faint signs left by animals, broken twigs, scattered tracks, disturbed soil. Water was nearby. Cade sensed it too. By midday they reached a narrow canyon where a small spring bubbled from the rocks, feeding a tiny pool bordered by tall grasses. It was the kind of place travelers seldom found unless guided by luck or instinct. Cade let his horse drink. Kosa knelt at the water's edge and touched the surface with reverence. This spring reminded her of hidden places her tribe once used during long journeys, where water was scarce, and life depended on the land's generosity. For a brief moment she almost felt at home. Cade watched her closely, not with curiosity, but with a strange pull he did not understand. Her presence at the water brought a calmness to the space. She moved with purpose, collecting cool water in her palms, washing dust from her arms and face, brushing her fingers through her hair. Even in silence, she carried a dignity no hardship could take away. After resting, they continued deeper into the canyon where the land widened into a sheltered valley. Here, grasses grew thicker, and birds circled overhead. Cade recognized the signs of a place animals frequented, a place safer than the open plains for stopping overnight. They set up another camp before the sun dipped too low. Kosa gathered wood with practiced efficiency. Cade tied his horse to a sturdy branch. The valley air held a crispness that hinted at the coming of colder months. The world around them quieted once more. But peace seldom lasted long in a land cut by conflict and survival. As dusk settled, and the fire began to glow, Kosa froze suddenly, her posture tense. She tilted her head, listening. Cade followed her gaze toward the ridge above them. Faint movement disturbed the brush, subtle, cautious, deliberate. Not an animal, not a lone wanderer. More than one. The silhouettes of 3 armed men appeared at the top of the ridge, scanning the valley below. One of them pointed toward the faint trail Cade and Kosa had left behind. Cade recognized the danger instantly. These men were not drifters, they were trackers, seasoned, organized, and moving with purpose. Whether they searched for him or someone else, it hardly mattered. The threats of the frontier rarely cared about reason. Kosa's pulse quickened. She knew what trackers could do, especially to people like her. Her people had long been hunted, pursued, and forced from their land. She had seen cruelty more than once. The sight of armed men above them awakened memories she had fought to bury. Cade stepped closer to her, not touching but anchoring. His presence offered silent reassurance as they retreated deeper into the shadows of the valley. They moved quickly but quietly, guided by Kosa's knowledge of hidden paths and Cade's steady instincts. The trackers descended from the ridge, following the trail with practiced eyes. Cade and Kosa reached a narrow crevice between 2 boulders, slipping into its shelter just as the men approached the camp they had left behind. From their hiding place, they watched the trackers inspect the remains of their fire, the impressions in the dirt, the freshly filled water canteens. The tension thickened like smoke. Kosa's breath grew shallow. Cade remained still beside her, a quiet anchor against the rising panic. They stayed hidden until the trackers moved on, following what they believed was the trail of 2 vulnerable travelers. It was hours before they emerged from the crevice. Kosa felt the tremor of fear slowly leave her body. Cade studied the horizon, ensuring the men were far enough away. Their bond, once built on necessity, had now been forged by shared danger. Something deeper had taken root. And for the first time, Kosa realized she was no longer alone in the world. The fire they returned to burned low, casting a soft glow over the valley floor. Trust, fragile, unspoken, and unexpected, had grown between them like the hidden spring among the rocks. They did not know what the coming days would bring. But they knew they would face them together. The dawn that rose over the high desert on the 6th day felt unlike any morning before it. The air was strangely still, as if the land itself held its breath while watching the fragile union forming between the weary cowboy and the Apache woman, who had once believed no one would ever want her. The hardships they had endured in only a short span of time might have broken weaker spirits, but instead, it had carved a bond that neither had expected, a bond forged in necessity, strengthened by trust, and given shape by a growing tenderness that neither dared name. The wound on the cowboy's shoulder had begun to knit, though it still throbbed whenever he moved too quickly. Yet despite the constant sting, he worked throughout the early hours, clearing what debris remained around the campsite from the ambush that had nearly taken his life. Each movement he made was slow, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of all he had survived, but every so often his eyes drifted to the Apache woman, as if reminding himself that survival had brought with it something unexpected. Someone unexpected. She moved quietly through the trees, gathering herbs and plants with practiced precision. Each time she knelt to pluck a leaf or strip bark from a branch, she paused for a breath, sensing the spirits of her ancestors. The same spirits she believed had guided her through shame, rejection, and loneliness, only to place her here, beside a man who should have been her enemy, yet had become the one person she could trust. That morning she ground leaves into a thick paste, mixing it with warm water and applying it gently to the cowboy's shoulder. The mixture burned at first, as all remedies meant for healing often did, but soon the fire dulled into a soothing pulse. The woman's fingers moved with a softness he had not felt in a long time. She had tended to him before, but now her touch carried something heavier, something filled with the weight of her own hopes. By midday they began preparing to move on. The mountains still loomed ahead, marking the border between the Apache lands and the cattle trails beyond. If they reached the ridges before nightfall, they could descend into safer territory. The cowboy adjusted his saddlebag as best as his shoulder allowed, while the Apache woman secured their provisions with efficient care. A calm silence existed between them, neither tense nor uncomfortable, but thick with the awareness that time was running short, for though they had grown closer, neither had spoken aloud the question that lingered in both their hearts. What would happen when they reached the mountains? Would this fragile companionship dissolve once they stepped beyond the land that had brought them together? Would the world allow the two of them, a lonely Apache woman desperate for acceptance and a hardened cowboy with a wounded past, to stand side by side? The Apache woman walked ahead of him as they traveled, her steps purposeful and steady. She knew these lands better than any trail map could capture: the hidden paths, the water-bearing shrubs, the signs of danger etched into the ground. The cowboy followed her lead unquestioningly, his trust in her now absolute. He felt the ache of fatigue creep into his bones, but it was overshadowed by a far greater ache, the fear of losing her. Hours passed, and together they climbed higher into the ridges. The ascent was slow and rugged, requiring careful footing on loose rocks and narrow ledges. At times the cowboy faltered, his injured shoulder pulling him off balance, but she always circled back, steadying him with her presence. Though she said nothing, her actions carried the weight of words unspoken. She did not want him to fall, not now, not ever. By late afternoon, clouds gathered overhead, casting shadows across the canyon walls. The wind shifted into a colder breath, carrying the scent of rain. The Apache woman paused on a ledge overlooking the valley below. From here, the world stretched far and wide, rolling plains, scattered forests, streams glinting like silver threads. It was a view that marked the edge of two worlds, hers and his. She stared at the horizon with a heaviness etched across her face. This place, this moment, was the crossing point she had feared. She had begged the spirits for a husband, for someone to see her as worthy despite her rejection by her own people. She had begged the cowboy for a chance at companionship, even if she believed he could never truly choose her. And now, as they stood at the final ridge, she feared that everything built between them would disappear once they descended into the land where he belonged. The cowboy stepped beside her, wincing as his shoulder pulled. He scanned the horizon, feeling something inside him tighten. The view before them meant freedom, but also a painful choice. He had survived because of her. She had guarded his life, risked her own, shared her knowledge, her strength, her quiet heart. She had asked for a husband not out of desperation, but out of the deep wound of isolation. And now he wondered if he had the courage to offer what she had begged for. The wind grew stronger, lifting her braids and carrying dust across the ridge. She turned away from the view and began preparing the small camp they would make before descending the next day. The cowboy helped her gather firewood as best as he could with one hand. As he worked, he watched her carefully. The way she moved, the way she avoided his eyes, the way something inside her seemed to be bracing for loss. As night settled, the fire crackled between them. The flames cast long shadows across the canyon, making the world around them feel suspended between earth and sky. The air was thick with unspoken truths. The Apache woman sat with her knees drawn close, her eyes fixed on the fire. The cowboy watched her quietly, wrestling with the final choice that lay before him. The world they shared in these mountains was ending, but another world, one they might build together, was waiting. The night grew darker. The wind swept through the trees in soft, mournful whistles, and somewhere deep within the closed space of his heart, the cowboy made his decision. He rose slowly, despite the pain, and stepped closer to her. The firelight flickered over his face, revealing the steady resolve that had carried him through every hardship he had ever known. The Apache woman looked up at him, startled, not by his movement, but by the certainty she sensed within him. This was the moment everything had been leading toward, the moment when the question she had carried for so long would finally be answered, and as the fire crackled and the mountains stood silent witness, the story reached its turning point.